Welcome to Short Skirts and a Long Scripture,
where we discuss and create a space to heal from religious trauma.
Welcome back to the podcast, friends. This is Short Skirts, Long Scripture. I'm Cass.
And I'm Hannah. Today we have a guest with us.
Hi. I'm Ted. Good to be here.
Awesome. Let's jump right in. So today we have Ted with us. Ted's story is kind of interesting because he's one of the founding members of this group that we actually grew up in. So he's going to get into that a little bit later. But the first thing that we always ask is, what would you consider this group that we were a part of? I see you have a lot of thoughts about this.
Well, I mean, I that's a good question. It's changed over the years. I mean, I tell people I grew up fundamentalist, homeschooled. That's been my story for, 25 years. And it was only recently that I started using the words cult-like or cult to describe it, which I know is a little controversial, right? Like cult means something. So I'm not willing to defend that to the death or anything, but I think cult-like is pretty accurate. Because when you look at like the definition of cult, and it's this like allegiance to a leader or an ideology, right? And, I think the way I grew up, there wasn't, at least how I grew up, we were kind of Gothard adjacent. We weren't necessarily, I remember going to a Gothard conference and all that stuff, but it wasn't like Gothard was our, leader. We weren't like fully into IBLP or anything like that. But for me, what it really comes down to is just the allegiance and the loyalty that the group demanded, where there was this sense that if you didn't follow these kind of obscure fundamentalist rules, then you were out and you were given the cold shoulder and you were just rejected, really. And so for me, that kind of fits kind of this cult-like atmosphere, right, of fundamentalism, where you can have all kinds of groups in the world, but when you have to abide by this really strict way of living or else you're out, that to me feels a bit cult-like. So that's kind of where I'm at with it.
No, that's valid. I totally get that. I see. Did you want to talk about really quickly, like the first generation homeschoolers? Because you're in a totally different generation than all of the kids that we were with.
Yeah.
I want to hear about that.
So I'm 42. I'm old. And it's interesting, right? So like born in the 80s. And so I was being homeschooled in the late 80s, early 90s. And I mean, in those days, there were like 5 families that we knew, right? It was really, really small scale, especially like homeschooling. We were in Oregon, right? So there's people that were homeschooling for all kinds of reasons for years. But I would say most of those reasons were like hippie reasons, not ideology or anti-public school reasons, which was more where kind of my family came from. So in those early days, not a lot of people doing it. So you stuck really close with the people that you knew who were.
Makes sense.
And we kind of made a geographical move from one town to the other, still fairly close. But when we did that, we started discovering other homeschoolers because we were, a little more rural than we'd been before. And then kind of between late 80s into when I graduated in 2000, the number of homeschool families just like exploded, and it went from this really, really small thing to, sports groups and, theater groups. There were just this incredible network of things that sprang up. And some of that was because like you had like the Greg Harris's writing books in the late 80s. My parents were going to those conferences. And so that was like feeding all of this stuff. But I was the oldest of 6, or I'm the oldest of 6 who were all homeschooled all the way through. And I graduated in a class, just to kind of illustrate this, I graduated in a class in 2000 of 11 other firstborn homeschoolers. Every single one of us were a firstborn. So it was like this.
Wow.
Very much this like all of this work that our parents and the community had done to sort of raise this next generation. We were the first ones. So there was a lot of pressure. There was a lot of performative stuff. And it was really kind of out of that experience that kind of the group was founded. So I think, I remember being 16 and kind of sitting in the living room, we were kind of associated with a kind of this country church. Not everybody went to that church, but that's kind of where it was starting to be birthed and formed. And, I'll speak for myself. I was one of those people who really leaned in really hard into this whole experience, right? I was a golden child of the homeschool movement. I adopted all of it. I don't think I was like a mean fundamentalist kid, but I was definitely a fundamentalist kid. And I lived that way and adopted all of that ideology. But we're all kind of sitting in the living room. And I think, our parents and us, we were all just kind of looking for a place together because we didn't go to public school. We didn't have groups of our own communities. I even actually went to a different church than this church, but just on Sundays. There wasn't a whole lot of other engagement. I didn't go to that youth group. So I think we were looking for some place to gather and to talk about stuff. I was also had gone to this like Worldview Academy in Colorado for a couple of like 2-week chunks of summers. And a lot of my friends went to that. And it was all about like Christian apologetics and it was very fundamentalist as well, but also kind of had that political underpinning too of like Joshua generation, kind of like we're going to raise you up. I mean, that wasn't a thing yet, but it was kind of the early pieces of Joshua generation. Like we're going to raise you up to sort of bring this into the world. So you can take over like local city council and be senators and like,
I remember.
Yeah, they wanted everybody to be the next councilman of their state or county or whatever.
Exactly.
They're like, let's ingrain these really, really like fundamentalist ideals in them now so they can go spread them throughout the state at the state level.
Exactly. I was super involved in that and like in the pro-life movement and all of that stuff. And I really think most of us, again, I can't speak for the other folks, but it felt like we were all buying into this really big. And, for our parents who'd invested a ton of their time, money, and energy into this, right? I mean, it wasn't easy to homeschool. It wasn't cheap to homeschool. You had to give up a lot of the things. Like this was a big deal because it's like, okay, look, our kids are turning out. Like their test scores are good. Their behavior is good. They're not dating. They're dressing this way. Like we kind of all started.
Very important. Yeah, exactly.
I didn't see anything but a PG movie till I was like 17. That's the we were just really good kids in that regard. And I suppose people can't see air quotes on a podcast. Good kids.
Yeah.
Because we built this sort of system that said this is what good is, right? And to the detriment of a whole bunch of other things that were going on. So, I think the youth group that you're talking about, like it didn't have that name yet, but it did by the time I think I was graduating like at 18. It was just really starting out. And I can share more about that later, but it became kind of a painful experience for me in particular because I wasn't doing well as a human, kind of like 17, 18, 19 years old and starting to question and starting to, battle depression and things. So for me, I kind of suffered a rejection from that group before it was really even fully formed, but that was the beginning of it. Probably a long time before you were involved, I'm guessing.
Yeah, a little bit for both of us, later? I'm sure.
Yeah,
At least 8 years, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
Before we even thought about showing up. But, well, that is a perfect segue for our next question, actually, is what is your background with the church and this community? And we can get more into your involvement with the community.
Well, I mean, that's how I was raised. I mean, there was this evangelical fundamentalist Christian theology piece that I was taught, and then there was this homeschool piece, and so kind of the convergence of those two things. It's interesting too, like in these communities of families, there were always families who were living even more conservative than we were, and like my family wasn't a family that made my sister wear a dress down to her ankles every day, that kind of
right.
But still, very. And then there were families who weren't quite as conservative and whose kids watched a PG-13 movie once in a while. But more or less, we were all kind of in this boat. There were some common kind of themes that we all, were living by. So yeah. But I didn't know anything different, right? And was never encouraged to really read or experience anything other than that way of living. So that was my whole world, and I lived it, embraced it. And frankly, it wasn't all bad either. Like the experience of it at the time, especially the early years before I was 15 or 16, I think were pretty positive. Even though I rejected a lot of the foundations of what I was giving because I think they were ultimately damaging. It's not like I was suffering daily traumas or hating
Right.
my life. But where it really started to fall apart for me was that I was, began to suffer with depression, probably 14, 15 years old. And I had no idea what it was, no language around it, never talked about, no support for that. And that was really, I mean, it was bad for two reasons. It was bad because I was going through it, didn't have help, but it was also bad because the community I was growing up in kind of rejected it even as a concept, right? Like,
Oh
you're
yeah, we've talked about
experiencing
that before.
that mental
Yeah.
health stuff, it's sin,
Mm-hmm.
or you need to pray more, and I had this actual discussion with my youth leader who had no capacity to
Right.
help me in any way that I needed. And I was in rough shape. It got really serious by the time I was 18. So that, I don't know if that answers your question or if I can share more, but
I specifically, I guess, have a question pertaining to your involvement with the community or group that we all share common knowledge of. Because you were like the first wave of
mhm.
people when it was like first created. So, I mean, how did it change from like the very beginning versus the end when you ended up leaving?
Well, I think first I'll say, like there were these, and I remember hearing you talk about this with a previous guest, like these common themes that you discuss in the group that kind of become the culture of the group. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, I've heard purity culture stuff that was true. Definitely performance based, like just doing good things. Definitely during my time though, like Josh Harris's book had just come out, like right before I graduated, like 1996 or 7. And so courtship was a huge deal. Like we put on courtship conferences. I think we had one
Oh.
for my youth pastor at the time. Like we put one on and he spoke at it. It was like a couple hundred people there. It was a big deal. So for me, I mean, ultimately, my experience was that I had done everything the group and my parents had ever asked of me, ever wanted me to do. And then when I started to have some issues and start asking a few questions, um, I kind of had the experience of rejection, right? And
Mm-hmm.
felt like, I remember actually feeling this in my heart at the time and I couldn't process it, but I felt it in my body. I was like, oh, you don't love me. You love what I do. You love what I do for the group.
Yeah.
You love how this makes you look. You love,
You like the image I put on for you and present.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think at the beginning, there were like a bunch of things I really couldn't control.
Mm-hmm.
I remember my parents thought maybe I had mono or something because I was so exhausted, which I didn't have, but I was just very tired. And, looking back, I was able to recover from depression pretty quickly after I did get the help I needed, after I, kind of left the community and sought therapy and had meds and all that kind of stuff. And it's really a past thing in my life. Like for the most part, it hasn't really come up again because, to be really honest with you, and I know this isn't true for everybody, but for me, a lot of, what depression was about for me was my upbringing. It was that I was
Yeah.
under the pressure and weight of performing.
Yeah.
That I wasn't really very connected to myself at all in the first place. And I think that's one defining thing about this kind of fundamentalist upbringing, is that they're always turning spirituality into something where you're seeking external authority and external affirmation and approval.
Yeah.
And they never really teach you to know yourself or to develop that personal. I mean, they talk about personal relationship, but it's really like, well, does it fit what the leaders have said? Does it fit,
Mhm.
Yeah.
what your
Exactly.
parents approve? And that for me became really damaging because I didn't know. I was 16. I had no idea who I was. Right. I mean, I could fit in, I could perform like crazy, but
Yeah.
I really didn't know who I was, and I really didn't have any sense of internal conscience or just knowing even what the Holy Spirit was and how that worked. So that's very damaging. I was an adolescent, but I was really stuck in that regard way back in my early childhood. It took a long time to learn what inner
Mhm.
authority is and like how to know myself.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
because of that, I think too, like we talked about this word cult, and I think like another phrase that I've used that's been very triggering, that one or two times I've used it to kind of refer back, it's been triggering to the people I've talked to about it, but I would characterize it as spiritual abuse, because there was this power and control that was exercised over me, um, that was ultimately really damaging to me, and was really not about me at all, not about care for me, but really about care for, the authorities' image and their goals, which I think is really selfish.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I processed it. But, I've also talked to people too, and that everybody's experience is different. I mean, I will say that I think it was particularly hard on firstborn homeschoolers, firstborns of large families, especially because we were like that ship that they send out to Antarctica before the other ships that just breaks the ice, like.
I agree.
The guinea pig children.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard on everybody, but I think like the first time I tried to talk about depression with my parents, it went really poorly. First time that I did something that was rebellious by the definitions of the group or of my family, which I bleached my hair. And I think if I wasn't 18, I was
ghastly.
like a week away from 18 or something. Like I was basically grown up. It was a big deal. And that was a huge sign of rebellion and a huge sign of like changing my parents and all that. So anyway, so I've begun to use the word spiritual abuse, and especially because I did the work. I don't know if I shared this with you, but I did do a lot of work in therapy, and then 5 or 10 years later went back and met with those people, and just very, very humbly, and I didn't try to be confrontational, but I just said, this is how I was hurt and wounded. Yeah. And there was no openness at all to hearing any of it. I mean, there was not even like a conversation, which to me was really frustrating. It's like, hey, I thought that the foundation of all this, of like being a pastor or a youth pastor or a youth leader or whatever, was care for youth, so even if you disagree, like how do you go care for people? And just didn't feel that years later. And so it was good for me though, because I could release that and go like, I don't need to hold on to this anymore. It wasn't my fault. So
yeah.
Wow.
I'm so sorry you had that response.
Yeah.
We've talked about this before. The way that we were talked to how to interact with people is always like, oh yes, we are to be Jesus to the world, which first of all created super arrogant teenagers because we were God now, but also then it became like, well, other people that aren't Christians are not good enough to hang out with us.
Yeah, exactly.
So it just really enforced that idea, like you were saying, like there's not really a base of care. There's not like the baseline of that.
Well, and I'll add, just to say that people get into homeschooling, and I know this podcast isn't necessarily about homeschooling, but for me, it's so intertwined with the group.
Oh yeah,
it was back then. People homeschool for all kinds of reasons, and I think it's really important to go back and kind of look at why our parents made those choices. And I don't think their motives were bad. I think my parents, my dad got saved at a Bill Gothard conference in the late 70s, and it turned his life around. And so he's in the middle of like this post-Vietnam, post free love culture that kind of ran rampant, and then there's these speakers like Gothard coming along saying, hey, there's a different way to live, and you do ABC and you follow this biblical wisdom. But it really quickly became legalistic and formulaic, right? Yep. But there was also, a bunch of reasons, but like another one that comes to mind is just like a real either fear of or rejection of public school for all kinds of reasons that I think were maybe a little bit blown out of proportion. But really, I think they wanted their kids to experience something higher quality, and without, you're going to go to public school and take drugs, like there's all of these things floating around, and then I think I didn't feel this in the beginning, but later in high school, it started to become not so much from my parents, but from the community, like really about a political ideology that different leaders, famous leaders, like the Dobsons and things like that they wanted to make a difference on like a cultural, political level. And the way to do that, right, is to train up these young people to take over, and I get that. That's how movements work, right? But what I didn't really discern at the time was that love was really never a part of that conversation. It was always apologetics, proving people wrong, being better than people by your behavior and performance.
Yep.
There wasn't any grace or love in the discussion, which isn't biblical at all. But I bought into it, right? I bought into it too as a semi-discerning teenager. Took me a
Right,
long time
exactly.
to learn from that, but yeah.
What is the word you just used?
Semi-discerning.
I can't talk apparently now either.
Just how it's
Semi-discerning teenagers that weren't really shown how to critically think, though, unless it was for
Yeah,
apologetics, unless it was for,
Yeah.
apologetics is defending your faith, unless it was, for sharing the gospel and making sure that you were right all the time. So a lot of damage was done with that too, when basically you're just sending kids out with, that's the only idea that you have,
Right.
of
Mhm.
go do that, but we can't critically think in any other way whatsoever. We can't make our own decisions because we're not allowed to. We're not old enough. We're immature. We need to seek the elders' approval or our parents'
Exactly.
approval or anything else. So real shit show, that one.
100%. Yeah. And I don't think I really grew up until I think I carried some of that same, I don't know, framework into my young adult years, where, I rejected fundamentalism pretty quickly because of depression and being rejected by the group. And I jumped into a more grace-based Christian way of living for many years. But I was still looking for somebody to affirm me, very much so, right? I was still looking for approval, which is very normal for an adolescent, right? But I had never grown out of that, and I continue that for many years. And it took a while, and it kind of took my own spiritual journey to finally get to the point where I had my own framework, my own inner authority, my own peace. Which doesn't mean authority doesn't matter, but knowing myself mattered so much more, and finally gave me the freedom to actually even talk about this too. Because I think even though I think I grew to get really bitter against many of these leaders, I never felt like I could say anything about it, even after I was out of it. I just, because the whole thing was like, you never speak against an elder or leader. You never speak. And I internalized that for a long time. Yeah. And then I stopped caring a few years ago, and now I don't care anymore. But, that's what I feel, and watching even new generations of people come out of that movement, super smart kids, right? And I was a pretty smart kid in terms of head knowledge. But it doesn't take very long to kind of dig in and realize, like, whoa, you don't really know who you are. You're just parroting things that you've heard, and you haven't lived. You haven't really worked out this stuff yet. You've just followed the rules and stayed in your lane and listened to your elders. And that's no way for anybody to grow up. I think anybody who knows about child development, adolescent development, will tell you that's not a good thing, regardless of whether religion's involved or not. It doesn't fit how people grow up. So, yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how you decided to grow out of that? Like, would you say you had a deconstruction process? Would you say you did unpacking or disentangling, or how did you handle that once you actually left the fundamentalist group? Because you said you just jumped out pretty hard.
Yeah, I mean, it's all kind of tender for me still, but and I'd love to share, but it's so personal, right? Like I did a very logical thing when I was just in my worst spot mentally. And frankly, I was suicidal for a while in my life, and just really struggling. I really didn't have anybody in my life. I didn't have anybody that really, I had people who cared about me. My family still cared about me, but I didn't have intact relationships to turn to. So when I first encountered in my own mind that there were things about how I was brought up that weren't true, it wrecked me, because that was my whole world. And so, and I think on top of that, because I was just in such a bad mental state, I rejected God completely, because I was like, wait, if this isn't true, then it's all not true, and fuck that, and I shoved it aside. And it didn't take me very long to realize that also wasn't true, right? That I was in desperate need of spiritual guidance and help from God, I guess. And there were people more associated with the other church I grew up in, that I didn't know a lot of people real well, but there were some people who reached out to me and were really helpful. And it's actually, I was friends with my wife, who is also the oldest of 6 kids, also homeschooled, also like very similar experience, who was my friend at that time, who was really there for me. But just I'd say 2 or 3 people who really saw me and helped me out. And then I think my parents came around a bit and kind of supported me the best they could. The relationship was fractured for a while there, but found a therapist, which was really good, a Christian therapist and all that. So I would not have called it deconstruction. I kind of jumped really quickly out of fundamentalism, but then really quickly into kind of more of a grace-based Christianity. Went to Bible college, went to Multnomah, thought I was going to become a pastor, was kind of on that, like that decade of my 20s. And then it was really in my 30s that I would say that I deconstructed, like in a different way, and deconstructed from Christianity for the most part. I'm still still have a very deep spiritual life, and I still believe in the divine, but I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily only a Christian. I practice other things too. So that deconstruction got really, really serious, where I was able to go like, wait, is the Bible actually inerrant? Like, does that actually make sense? What is sin? What is sin actually? What is evil? Those kinds of questions. And just starting to take some of the things that I had always accepted and holding them up to the light and going, what's true and what's not. A person who really helped me in my 30s was a guy named Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan friar, and a deeply committed Catholic.
Sidebar Hannah here. For more on Richard Rohr, check out the link in the show notes to his podcast, Another Name for Everything. Okay, back to the show.
But just has a really big, broad worldview that he holds. And it's been really good for me because he, again, going back to this whole not having an internal life or internal authority, right? So in this solo scriptura version of Protestantism, where the only thing you're really supposed to listen to is the Bible, right? Which gets kind of co-opted by this, like, well, but also the interpreters of the Bible are your youth leaders, and they tell you what it means. You really miss out on so many other aspects of the Christian tradition. And so for me, it was being reintroduced to the mystics, to people who had the experience of God, not even necessarily in a Pentecostal way, like speaking in tongues and stuff like that, but just deeply connected to the divine through their own prayer life and their own meditation stuff. That transformed me. And a lot of them did that through things that were a lot more quiet than Pentecostal Christian, which I love Pentecostal Christianity, but I don't practice it because it doesn't do it for me. But the contemplative prayer, meditation, silent retreats, vision quests, things like that, ritual, really met me where I was at. And that's where I started to find healing and spiritual growth. And also realize too that, like, I think God is bigger than the boxes we put God in.
Imagine. Like, what is this idea?
Exactly. And so for me, that's what deconstruction is. It's a way of unlearning something that you learned that might have been even the only thing you could have grasped at the time.
Yeah.
But as you do that, your view of God expands. And if you aren't given a framework of theology where God can expand, then you really aren't accepting God as all powerful, right? Because you've already put him in a box by saying, this is who you are. And I understood that at 5, and I'm going to keep that when I'm 15 and 25 and 35. And instead going, wait a minute, letting God teach you who they are over and over and over again requires a lot of humility, because you have to give up what you thought before and allow that to grow you. So anyway, it was the Christian tradition, it was the spiritual practice, it was all of these things that we weren't given I wasn't given as a tool growing up. It was just read your Bible and pray and listen to your elders.
That's all we had to work with.
Yeah. And we already know, from the Bible that that's not true, but we don't really practice it. We don't really make ourselves available to a Saul experience where he becomes Paul, where it completely transformed what he thought he knew about the Jewish scriptures and who God was. And yet God showed up for him and said, no, that's not who I am. Stop killing my people. So, that was kind of it for me. Yeah. And so I think ultimately we're all on a journey to God. And he shows up in ways that we don't expect. And that absolutely doesn't mean that there's not sin and evil in the world. I think there is. But I think it does mean that he's bigger than all of that and can break through all of that. And he has for me. Or they have for me. Try to change the pronouns up a little bit once in a while.
Sure.
Well, I'll add something as I'm looking at my notes here a little bit too. But, I think I was pretty outspoken against fundamentalism about 4 years ago because of like what was going on in politics and COVID and all
Okay.
that stuff. And I was still pretty connected to certain people in the community of old who, for whatever reason, stuck around on social media and followed me. I don't know why,
Yeah.
but I felt like I still had some little bit of credibility to burn, and I burned it all in 2020.
Oh, okay. Well,
But, I think like, going back to Gothard, right? And we talked about Gothard before we started, right? So, and I don't know if you watched Shiny Happy People, right? I watched it and I was like, well, I wasn't directly involved day to day with Gothard, so there's no big deal. And I was so triggered watching it. It was because I recognized so
Horrifying.
many of the patterns and the things. And even
Yeah.
though I'd only gone to one Gothard conference, I realized how much he'd influenced my parents and all the people around them. And of course, the documentary does a good job of kind of exposing some of the, spiritual abuse, I'd call it, of that way of living. But there's another documentary coming out about Bill Gothard, and it's about the 20 women that he sexually assaulted.
What's it
And
called?
that's being made by one of my friends as a producer on that. And, he's been credibly accused. The problem was that the statute of limitations is up. So they couldn't actually charge him with anything. And, it's not like that means that everybody who's in fundamentalism abuses women sexually or anything like that. But what it does is it creates an environment where abuse is, can thrive, right? Because you create
Yes.
these contexts where there isn't accountability. I like to go back and think of another Mark Driscoll, right? Who very much was a conservative fundamentalist pastor who finally got fired by his own elder board, right? The only form of accountability that a pastor like that recognizes is their own elder board. And they finally fired him because of his anger issues, because of money, dishonesty, and lack of transparency, because of not listening to authority. And what was his response, right? Like, they're wrong, and he went and started another church in another state. So I think that's one of the things about, like, and then, I believe in leadership. I believe in how elders can be a good thing, right? And how that kind of authority in your life can be transformative and healing in the right context. But I've been so fascinated too by, like, how do we create communities that allow for transparency and accountability and love and grace, rather than create these little shelters for people to kind of do what they want, right? And I think that was a key thing about how I grew up, is that, well, there wasn't a whole lot of pushback. I think I've heard in some of your episodes about some of the pushback that you were all engaged in. You were all way braver than my generation, right? Like, we just fell in line.
Listen, we were out to fuck shit up.
You guys pushed the boundaries. We didn't push the boundaries hardly ever, or I didn't anyway. There are a couple maybe who did, but one thing was that we pushed the boundaries and we got excommunicated, so it was kind of costly. But the other thing was too, we just accepted it. And when you can't challenge authority, or when you can't challenge bad practices, or when you can't even ask questions, right? Like a why question. Why do we do this? What is the point of doing this? Without getting, harsh pushback. It just creates an environment where abuse can happen of all kinds. Spiritual abuse being kind of the number one thing. And so, why are there hundreds of documentaries about cult leaders being abusive? Because it creates that where it thrives, and you have to be so careful with that. Not everybody's evil, but when you don't have accountability and you aren't submissive to each other in love, and you aren't one reason I like deconstruction as a phrase is that it gets at when the foundations of something that you learned are rotten, then just continuing to build a house on those rotten foundations is not going to work. You do have to deconstruct by tearing it out and starting over. Doesn't mean you have to go around burning houses down, but if something's truly rotten at the core, you start over and start fresh. And I eventually had to do that.
I have a couple questions. So some of the notes that you have at the end of this doc are related to how you discovered and created different types of boundaries in relationships. Did you want to talk about those? For example, the boundaries with family members, or your, like, how you interacted with your spouse, how you treated them based on how we were taught to interact with, like, men and women, like who's more important in the relationship, things like this that are just weird ideas. Like, how did that go for you?
Well, boundaries have been hard, right? I think I had to create some boundaries with some family members and friends early on just because I was so wounded, and it's the
Right.
only way I could really get onto a healing journey. And I had a lot of shame, honestly.
I'm so sorry
Shame
for
is
you.
a
Yeah.
theme, right? We could talk about. There's so much shame at the basis of this way of growing up, and shame is how, whenever there's a challenge or rebellion or somebody isn't in line, shame is how it's addressed. It's never through love. It's usually through like, you should be ashamed for wearing that, or you should be ashamed for talking to them. So shame was just it's been a part of my journey. Frankly, it's still coming up, because you can change your mind about shame. And I did like 2 decades ago, but your body doesn't really actually change until you heal or go through some kind of embodied ritual to let go of that. And so I've done some of that work, but it's still there in a big way. And shame still makes me ashamed sometimes of even being in community with some of those people, because it hurts so much just to even be around them, because they think they're fine. And it's like, can't you see that you're not? And also you hurt me.
Yeah.
So that's like one aspect of that, but it's gotten a lot better over the years. And I've had open conversations with my parents that have been good, and with a few different friends and family. And also we have some just really close, wonderful, beautiful friends who grew up with us in those communities. I mean, we didn't have the identical experiences, but they know enough about us and we know enough about them, and we've deconstructed together, and we can talk and share and sit. And that's such a gift. Like, I literally have my wife and I and a couple other people, we have known each other since we were 8, 9, 10 years old, and we still close friends. Our families are close friends. We don't even believe the exact same things, but we had that shared experience, and we've all come out of it on some level going, we don't want that for ourselves. And that is such a blessing. So I don't know if that answers your question. Another kind of related but distinct piece of that too was just, I think one of the very first things I knew for sure is that I didn't believe in the patriarchal system. Even before I didn't fully understand how Gothard had sort of co-opted that into this, the umbrella of authority.
Oh yeah.
Father and husband and wife and kids. Such bullshit. I just knew, like, and I think I knew it maybe even from just like having a couple of women teachers teach me at Multnomah and go, fuck, like that. Wow. It transformed me. I was like, but I can't learn that from you because you're a woman, right? Like, just didn't
exactly.
The concept.
Like there was just clearly wisdom, and I was like, I have no business in saying that you can't teach or saying that you can't be an elder even, so that whole paradigm for me was like very beginning of our marriage to my wife. We knew that that's not what we wanted, that we were going to be equal partners, but also not having a roadmap for that at all was challenging. Right. And it is harder, I think, to be equal partners when you aren't in something where one's the head of the other, because it's not simple. You have to be in constant relationship and discussion and communication. But not hiding behind theology or the Bible or God to say, well, I have more weight than you do, or you should submit to me and not the other way around. We just didn't do that from day one. And that gets even trickier too when you're raising kids, right? Because you definitely have, I have a couple of the most beautiful, but also tenacious, assertive daughters you can ever imagine. They're wonderful. And I don't think the patriarchy is necessarily a part of it, but there's just this sense too of like wanting so badly to raise them differently than I was raised, and give them every opportunity to develop their own sense of self and not just accept what I say as being truth, but also they're kids still. They're not grown-ups. They're not even teenagers yet. So you still have to sort of exercise some level of like explaining to them things that maybe, or not explaining things to them they're not old enough to understand. Or sometimes you just have to say like, because I said so and I'm the parent, which I hate that phrase, but also kind of have to do that when they're 5, so there's all of those things that play in, and then you kind of, but my ultimate goal is that I'm raising a grown-up. I'm not raising a kid. And I'm also not raising them in my image. I'm trying not to raise them in my image. I'm trying to raise them in the image of themselves, of who they are. And so trying not to take too much, have too much expectation for them to perform or to be a certain way to make me proud of them. Of course, I want them to be amazing humans and succeed in life and all that. But if I start to get caught up in how it makes me look, then I'm like, wait a minute, maybe that's not what this is about. So how much of my own trauma am I reading into things, right? Like unfairly.
Okay.
I was
yeah.
traumatized. So there isn't a evil fundamentalist around every corner. And my parents, the grandparents mean well, and they're really good people, and they're fine around their parents. So I have to be careful that my own trauma doesn't inform my decisions. They're not being raised the way I was. It's not going to be the same. But I also want to be intentional and careful.
I have a couple small notes to add based on what you just talked about. A couple things. You mentioned that you have your kids around Christianity a lot, but you're not like actively trying to convert them or something. That is a wild foreign concept to how we were raised, because we were in this community of people that was like, we're Christians. That's who we are. Our children will become Christians. If they turn away from the Lord, to use Christianese phrasing, like it's our fault somehow. So like there was this weird element of you're in charge of your kids' souls, which is not really true, because per the Bible that we were raised with, God is in charge of souls. Like it's our job to be good examples of Christianity and to love people like Jesus and to invite them to this place to meet God. But like it's not our job. Like we're not in charge of their salvation per se, which I think is really important to know, because we didn't know that when we were in this group. Like I remember coming out of this community and being like, every non-Christian person that I meet, I have to convert them, because if I don't, they're going to hell and it's my fault. Like, no, that's not what the Bible says.
That's a heavy burden too, right? If you take that seriously.
And you know,
that's a tough one.
The way that people would soften towards God would only happen when I was just being their friend and like not actively like every conversation we're going to talk about Jesus. Somewhere in there I'm going to praise God, bless the Lord. Like we don't need to do that. God can speak for himself, first of all. Like it's not our job.
Exactly. It kind of segues into something I was going to share. You know, I think I can't necessarily express where I'm at in this way that just is like nice and tidy in terms of like my own faith journey. But I'm a Christian in the sense that I think Christianity is a beautiful story. And Jesus is an incredible human who was also divine. And I think that there's a ton of healing, and I mean, at the end of the day, we're all humans who are broken in some way. Maybe broken is too Christian of a word for it, but we're all messed up humans trying to figure out how to live, right? We all have a dark side. We all have a light side. We're all trying to figure out what that means. Those are universal concepts. And Christianity does some amazing things to help us figure out our path to light, our path to God. And we can get into systematic theology about that. And there's some that I believe more than others, but I specifically reject 3 kinds of theology I grew up with that I think ultimately probably underpin all of the damage that we're here talking about today, because of the way they're just so comprehensive and so damaging. So like one is like the total depravity of humans, right? Like that we are all just evil at our base, and the only good that can come from us is if we do pray the prayer. And even then, right, we're still totally depraved and nothing but rotten rags, or whatever the phrase is. Just don't think that's true. And I don't think that's true based on basic anthropology. We're not like totally depraved people. We obviously have good in us too. We do some awful things, but we have good. The other one is really transformed me, and that was this idea of substitutionary atonement theory, right? That Jesus had to take our place to save us from an angry God. Really screws with our theology. Doesn't even really line up with the Bible. And ultimately, I think for me, I was really set free when I no longer saw Jesus as having to save me. When he wasn't requiring my worship, he was asking to be followed, right? He lived a way of life that was asking to follow us. And so many of us just jump to, I'm saved, right? This is the story of the evangelical church in America, I believe, is that everybody's worshiping Jesus. Nobody's actually living like Jesus. Like if we really lived like Jesus, it would be pretty radical, but it would be much more about the poor, and about finding the meek and humble things in the world, like all of these things that he actually lived, versus like, how much does it really mean to him to actually just gather and sing songs to him? What's that actually doing? Right? Like, as a spiritual practice, I can respect that. But I don't think he's sitting up there going, I didn't get my worship time today and I'm really angry about it. And the third one is like this premillennial theology that came out with like the Left Behind series, which is just one of many theories.
Traumatizing. All of them.
I don't know where you're going with this, but I'm already prepared. Let's go.
But this idea that, like, I think that it leads to this idea, or it's sort of implied in the idea that this earth is going to be destroyed and we're going to get a new heaven, a new earth. And so the things that are here don't matter. And I just don't believe that. I think that's all kinds of excuses to reject talks about environmentalism, to reject talks about global climate change, to reject talks about taking care of the earth or even our bodies. Like, everything in the Bible, I think, points to a renewal of what's already here, not a destruction and a rebuilding, starting over, right? This is the earth we have. These are the bodies we have. Jesus came back and appeared to his disciples and bore the wounds of the crucifixion on his hands. It didn't start from scratch. Like, that carried forward. So you take those three theologies and start to deconstruct them, it really changes the conversation. Something Richard Rohr says is a good theology doesn't cancel out a bad anthropology. So you have to understand what it means to be human in conjunction with who God is. You can't just only study theology, right? And how is that threatening to us if we believe that Jesus was fully human and fully God? We skip over the fully human part so quickly, we miss all of that piece and we just jump to his divinity. So for me, kind of started thinking that way maybe at the end of Bible college, but I didn't really have teachers yet. So for me, the teachers kind of came in my 30s, and that was really helpful.
Actually, the idea that Jesus was fully human is something we've talked about before, specifically around things like mental health and his interaction with how he treated women. And like, if he is supposed to be our example, like traditional Christianity will teach you, like, your example is Jesus, be like Jesus, right? And so we look at Jesus and we're like, he had anxiety, he was depressed for a while there, he took quiet time, he was like respectful of people that were outcasts in society. And then we don't hear that when we go to this youth group. We hear like, men are in charge, be God. Like, I feel like we're missing something here. So coming out of that and realizing, wait a minute, Jesus actually knows what it's like to be me because he was human.
Yeah,
was a really big game changer in how I thought about, like you were mentioning, different theologies, how I thought about what I should be looking at the world like, how to interact with the world. You mentioned climate change really briefly. Like, traditional Christianity doesn't care about climate change.
No.
But there are portions of scripture where God is like, subdue the earth, take care of the earth, be good stewards of what I've given you. And apparently we just skip over that. Like, that's not actually somehow. So it's like a lot of things learning now in my deconstruction journey personally, my unpacking of what kind of garbage was that? Where is the truth in this weird point that we learned?
Right. And like the ability to build an entire culture around a very flimsy theology, like purity culture, or really courtship, I think is an example of that, right? How biblical is courtship again? Like, if we were really doing biblical things with relationships, we'd be doing some really awful things and some
we would. Old Testament crap.
Not into it.
Let's not.
Yeah. And again, I think there can be some honest discussion about maybe some of the motivations around, like, okay, dating gone wrong or dating gone bad. Certainly that, I mean, certainly I'm not supporting like hookup culture or like going on Tinder to find your spouse. But it just took such a hard right turn into some really unhealthy areas, and created, again, another framework by which that community could use to point to the world and go, you all are wrong and we're all right, which just, just damaging. And then, too, like, the patriarchy isn't just this harmless little thing that creeps into our stuff. Like, it's a way for men to control women, to control conversations, to control the church, to control theology. And you can trace that back thousands of years, and it's the basis of just a lot of really horrible things, because it's about power, right? It's about empowerment. And I think that, honestly, like, Jesus came as a man who really flipped the discussions around power on their head. Like, power between men and women, completely flipped it around. Power between the poor and the rich, completely flipped around. Power between the church, maybe I shouldn't use that word, that's a bit wrong, but I would say the Jewish leadership, who maybe we think of
for sure,
as
like the Pharisees and whatnot.
Power between them and the people who came to worship, right? Like, literally flip tables over because it was so corrupt. So in that regard, changing the discussion about power really would probably be a better discussion for the youth group that we grew up in. Let's talk about that for a minute. But that just really threatens, I think, the people who want to keep it. Again, not that they're nefarious people,
right?
But they too have bought into something that I think is really, really damaging. And I'll just put a plug in here, because I do men's work now. That's one of the places that I spend my time, is helping men go through rites of passage and initiation rites, because those are so absent in our culture, where they can really discover, really learn to transform their pain so they don't transmit their pain. And all of that work was stuff started by Rohr, but it was also based on indigenous cultures doing rites of passage. And I'll say this, and it might be a little controversial for maybe the other side of the, on the progressive side of things, but I think ultimately the patriarchy is as damaging to men as it is to women. I mean, it was true for me, right? Like, it's damaging to young men to be told to be that way and to hold that up. And certainly they're experiencing the power, and they end up being in the place where they're the abusers and the oppressors and all that. But it also keeps them in a cage too, and they don't know their true selves, and they're disconnected from their own tenderness, their own gentleness, their own power, and frankly, the power of the feminine connection to God, right? Like, if God is not either gender, which is what I think is true, then we're missing out on the feminine God, right? And once you're introduced to the feminine God and the masculine God, or the non-gender God in general, you're like, oh, this is a whole another side to who God is that I just never experienced. And it was transformative for me to learn that.
I think I am delighted by this idea that God is just beyond our understanding. like we said earlier, when you put God in a box, it so limits your ability to interact with anything, especially anything related to God. Or, for example, we were raised to try to have some kind of a relationship with God or with Jesus, right, through our Christianity. And so if God is in a box, then how do you reach it? How do you do anything with that? How do you interact with that? You can't.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that gets into like the theology of the Trinity, which for me was this, like, grew up, we were deeply Trinitarian in theory, but we never talked about how the Trinity actually worked, or why Trinitarian theology is what we use to explain God. And when you get right down to it, Trinitarian theology explains that God's in relationship with God. Like, the essence of who God is relationship, right? And you've seen probably the, and I don't remember, I'm going to forget the name of the icon where somebody painted representations of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and they're all looking at the observer, who is the fourth person in relationship with the Trinity, like, as you're observing the icon. The idea there being, though, is that we discount so quickly the human experience of God that we're also a part of that, right? So if it's this relationship, then it's just as important for you to show up in that relationship and to bring who you are and to let God work through that. And instead, I hear things in songs, and I was reading theology that's like, well, you have to become nothing so that he can become everything, right? You have to become less so that he can become more. And I get that. I get what that's trying to get at, but ultimately, be who you are, bring who you are, let God work with who you are. You are in relationship with God, and God is telling us that they are a relationship in the first place. So it's all about relationship, right? And I think that's the piece that I was really in my 20s transformed by that concept. And I actually was working at another church and had done a number of internships while I was in Bible college. And then I worked in social work for a long time, right, with people on the streets and all that. Ultimately, like, I don't think Christianity or religion is anything if we can't be in relationship, right? Like, it's really on the streets, in the neighborhoods, with our families, with each other, that's all being worked out, that's all happening. And frankly, that's how Jesus lived their life too. There's always the examples of the Christians who kind of hide away, and the Desert Fathers were incredible. They kind of snuck away from Rome and wrote these incredible writings and were mystics and all that. And for a period of time, that was really important. But if we're completely cut off from our communities, what good are we doing, right? So you go back to the fundamentalism and the homeschool stuff. I mean, we were so cut off from, at least I was, from anybody else, anything else, and so insulated and insular, I guess, from the real experience of just knowing our neighbors and other humans, that what good was it, right? Like, what good is it to live that way ultimately? And then if we did interact, it was to convert them, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, that just feels like a bait and switch, because you're not interested in relationship at that point. You're not interested in loving the person. You're interested in just, I don't know, converting them, making them think what you think in life, so that you can feel good about them not going to hell.
You kind of just covered everything that I was going to ask with this question. I was going to ask you, where are you at now in your spiritual journey? You kind of answered everything, but do you have anything else you want to say more to that point?
Oh, I did kind of cover all the things on my list. So yeah, thank you for letting me just speak freely and so forth. And I will just say too that I didn't know you were doing this podcast till I heard about it from my brother, and then I started listening, and it just really touched me. Well, it made me angry, first of all, because I didn't realize that youth group had existed for so long after I'd left.
Oh no.
And I was I was just like, I guess I just thought that it would have just burned up and, self-destructed, I guess.
Right.
Oh no.
And it went on for a while. But then I was thinking of, like, because Anna, I remember you as a kid around my family. Yeah. And so in my mind, it was like, how was that still around when Hannah grew up and still damaging her? And you guys were talking about the same exact shit. Like
That's
same.
What I'm saying.
How is this possible? People have not moved on. And I'll give credit to a lot of people in my former circle they don't think like I do, but they have moved on from some of that damaging fundamentalism. And I'm proud of them for that. But I did, again, hearing that it was still going on. But anyway, as I was hearing you unpack it all with grace and a lot less bitterness than I have. I mean, I'm sure you're disillusioned and bitter on some level like I am. But I was so angry for a long time. And also, I never thought to bring it to a constructive venue like you've done with this podcast. So it's been really great to listen. I think that there's probably, like you mentioned, people all over the world listening who have similar experiences, who maybe weren't even in this youth group and are really I think they're probably feeling seen and heard, right? Probably because I thought that I was the only, I thought our group was the only group. And then as I grew up, I was like, oh, there was a bunch of us all over the world experiencing. So hopefully people don't feel quite so alone.
That's the goal.
Yep, that was our whole point of this podcast, is so that people can feel heard and not feel alone, because that's what we felt like, is utterly alone.
We had no resources. No one was telling us, oh, that's actually not an okay thing. Oh, actually, it's okay to not be okay. Oh, actually, that's damaging. Don't do that. So we just want to make a space where it's possible to hear different perspectives and know that that's okay.
Yeah. Well, thanks for what you're doing. I think it really matters. So, and it's encouraging to me too. So
thank you so much for sharing with us. Love hearing your story. The fact that we have people from multiple generations sharing about the same community is just incredible to me.
Mind blowing.
You would think sad, there's been some growth.
That's a kind way of saying it's nice to have somebody who's old come on our show and share. No.
The elder millennials.
Yeah, yes. Oh yeah, I'm right in that little 5-year elder millennial. Yeah, that's right.
We're the tail end of it.
We've now had people from 4 different of the generations come on and share, and I love it.
So not to co up the end here, but can I ask each of you a question?
Go for it.
I'm curious, I've listened to some of your podcasts, but now that I kind of shared my story over the last bit, is there something in particular that resonated about what I said? I'm just curious, like how your own story kind of intersects with mine, or if there was a place that you thought like, oh, that made sense to me.
She does this. She'll take notes when we have a guest, and then she'll be like, let me tell you.
It's impressive.
Listen, people have so much more knowledge than I am, and I'm like, let me add that to my repertoire. So I like, oh, that sounded good. Let me write that down. Oh, that was a good point. Let me write that down.
Take it away, Cass.
Well, no, because if I go through the notes, it's going to be really confusing. First thought, were we all suicidal at a point in our time here? Like, let's just start off strong.
Okay.
It seems like we were, though. Like, we all had, like, went through this phase of having that feeling and maybe not knowing what it was called. And then later being like, oh, that's what it was. Or self-harm or whatever you wanted to call it, which is, you know, we didn't have anybody to talk to about any of that either. So that was a really difficult point to be in this group specifically, when all you're taught is suicide is bad. If you do it, you're going to hell. So
depression's bad.
Yeah,
Christians
all of it.
don't have depression. They have the joy of the Lord. Like, we don't have
Mhm.
depression. What do you mean?
That's right.
I was never suicidal. I just checked out. Like, my response to this kind of pressure and the depression and the extreme mental health issues is that I just completely lost the ability to emote. Just didn't have that for quite a few years. I forgot what it was like to be joyful or to be angry or to be sad. It was just like nothing. So when I came out of that community and I discovered what it was like again, I was like, oh, this is really heavy.
I remember
if that was I wonder if that was your body's defense mechanism to protect you. Because had you been feeling fully, it probably would have just fried everything.
I mean, that's what happens in physical, sexual, like emotional abuse too, because I have that from even before getting into this group, not sexual abuse, but emotional and mental abuse, I guess. I don't remember what it's called, but
psychological.
Psychological abuse. It shuts down your brain in order to preserve whatever brain power literally that you have left, so that you can hopefully come out of that and kind of rebuff everything and make it work. But I mean, so that's exactly what it was your brain salvaging what was left.
Right. And then later when you're doing your healing work and you're in a better spot to handle it, then you revisit those and can re-engage those feelings, but from a place of safety. But also it hurts so bad, right? Because you're like, I had to numb out, and now I'm done numbing out, but also, whoa, I don't know if I'm ready to feel this.
Exactly.
Yeah, and sometimes it can be a lot at once, and you have to, you know, shut back down and slow down. But a lot of what you said resonated. Like we went through a lot of the same things, so it's like, oh yeah,
imagine
I remember that.
Continuing this garbage continuing still
18 more years.
Well, one thing that Cassie has said before that made me think of this conversation, at one point you were like, either we were the shit or we were shit. Like, that's what our two feelings were coming out of this community.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Either this or that. Like, you're either at the top or literally below the bottom. So how we have all interacted and like disentangled from that weird feeling of extremes and figured out where we actually are in the world and who we actually are, not based on what the elders of this community told us we are. It's been a totally different journey for everyone. This is one of my favorite things about having guests, is hearing everyone's totally different story and then being like, okay, where are you at now? And it's all totally different, and I love it, and I'm so proud of everybody for like surviving. Like, you made it, Ted.
I did. I made it. Yeah, exactly. I have to give myself a little credit now, because it's like, whoa, how did I get through that? I mean, the sad, not to bring a downer into it, the sad thing is I think there are a few people who didn't make it. Like, I have that list of like the 11 other firstborn homeschoolers and lost track of a few of them. But I mean, I did not have it as hard as some people did. There was some experiences that aren't mine to share that do get into sexual abuse, that do get into just some really deep, dark, harmful things that are more permanent in nature.
Mhm.
Fortunately for me, nothing was terribly permanent. Just really hard stuff, and I'm glad I avoided that, but not everybody did. So I think that's maybe where on a positive note, the podcast can help people with that, hopefully sooner and earlier. I didn't have anybody to talk to about this stuff.
Yeah.
So the one good thing is now that we've had many generations who've come through that,
Yeah.
there's more
There's
people to
people
support
there that
them
can be
too,
there for you.
right? And to fight that whole ideology.
Yeah.
Yeah, that whole like you're either shit or the shit. That's really good. I mean, it's
Thank
such
you.
bad adolescent psychology anyway. If you're trying to run a youth group, to
Yeah.
treat youth like there's no room to grow, there's no room
I
to
know.
be human or failure. Like I don't know how we thought that was good, but
Sometimes people doing their best is not great.
Is not the best. Yeah.
All right, Ted, any other thoughts? Anything you want to plug? Any advice?
not a bit. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really great to talk to you both.
Thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
coming. We really
Yeah.
appreciate your time, your story.
Yeah.
It's good stuff.
All
All right, friends. Thank you for listening with us again. Thank you, Ted, for coming on. It was awesome to get to hear your story from an elder generation. If you guys ever want to share your story or reach out to us, our website is shortskirtslongscripture.com. We're on Instagram at Skirts and Scripture, or send us an email, skirtsandscripture@gmail.com.
Okay, we're going to have to come back to it. It's not formulating. The nimbus cloud is not there.
My husband and his clouds.